What did the Nabataeans think happened to you after you died? Were the dead gone, or was there a continued relationship between the living and the dead? Hey everyone, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the Bible, its lands, civilizations, and archaeology. This week I'm happy to be joined once again by Dr. Lucy Wadeson. Lucy is an archaeologist who specializes in Nabatean mortuary structures and has spent more than their fair share of time inside Nabatean graves. In this episode, we discuss not just the Nabataeans' tombs, impressive as they are, but the larger questions these tombs present. Like, what does the visual dominance of Nabataean tombs tell us about their ideas of death? What can we learn about the connection between the living and the dead through ritual practices like feasting and gift-giving? And who are these impressive tombs really for, the dead or the living? Remember, for weekly bonus episodes, early access to ad-free video podcasts, and exclusive bonus content, you can join us on Patreon at patreon.com/BibleandArc. So settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation about Nabatean ideas of death, burial, and the afterlife. Dr. Wadeson, thank you so much for coming back and agreeing to return to talk more about the Nabataeans and something that we discussed a little bit before, their burials, and I think maybe what got more people's attention here, the ideas of the afterlife that maybe we can pull out of some of what we have from their burials. So thank you so much for taking the time to come back and talk to us again today.
Thanks for having me back. I'm glad to be here and have the chance to talk about the Nabataeans some more.
It was a fascinating conversation last time, and if you didn't hear it, I would say you don't have to pause this one, but maybe put it on right after this episode. Dr. Wadeson came last year to talk some when Petra was in the news because of a, let's say, discovery, rediscovery for TV type of situation. And we talked through some of Petra and the Nabataeans and the architecture there. And so if you've heard that conversation, you have a good, I think, background coming in for today. And if you haven't, you're not totally out of luck because you can go back and listen to that at any time. But today we want to narrow in a little bit more on some of what your specialty is within that world of the conversation we had last time, the burial practices, the customs, and some of these ideas. And you mentioned this in the last episode as one of the things that caught your interest as you were considering what you wanted to study. Could you say a little bit more about that, how this led to your fascination and your focus, and kind of, I guess maybe also, what is it that you do? Because that is one of those questions I think a lot of people ask archaeologists. So you're an archaeologist, and what does that mean, and what do you do with that?
Well, I think that I have been interested in ancient death and burial practices from quite a young age. The first time I saw an Egyptian mummy, I was probably about 5 years old at the local museum in Christchurch, New Zealand. And I was always fascinated from that moment onwards. It was really kind of a pivotal point. So I've always had that interest. And the thing about the Nabataeans, of course, is we know so little about their funerary practices, their burial customs, and that makes it more intriguing, wanting to find out and having the chance to learn more about them and discover these things. So, yes, as an archaeologist, well, we're not digging all the time. And in fact...
Which is a surprise for some people. Archaeologists are just digging, always digging. That's all you do, is sometimes the impression.
Sure. Well, I'm not employed as a field archaeologist, so I'm not in the field all the time. But I have excavations of tombs in Petra in the so-called Royal Necropolis. I'd say half the time is actually clearing out the rubbish and the dust from these tombs before we can actually excavate. So, in fact, out of the time we're in the field, very little scientific excavation actually takes place, a lot of clearance first. And then the rest of the time, 90% of the time is researching the findings, reading up on new articles, new research, and figuring it all out, really.
And within your excavations of the tombs, could you say a little bit about your specialty or your area of interest within that? Because there's a lot that comes out of an excavation of a tomb, as we talked about before. There are the human remains, there are the grave goods. Then there's also all of that social context or inferred beliefs or practices that can come out of that. For your specific interests, maybe, and maybe it touches a number of these things, what are you most interested in spending your time in after you've been able to do the unfortunate stuff of the clearing and got to the material that you wanted?
I'm a classical archaeologist, so I'm coming more from the art and architecture approach. So first of all, initially, my interest was the funerary architecture of the Nabataeans, the rock-cut facade tombs, and also, any visual material related to that. But obviously with a tomb, there's so many different aspects. We have the art and architecture. Like you say, we have sometimes the inscriptions, so we need the help of epigraphers. We have the human remains, so we need bioarchaeologists to study those. So we have various experts who all come together and work on this material. But once we do have the data and the findings, of course, my interest is putting it all together. How does it all work together? So looking at the broader context, what does this funerary inscription mean in relation to the type of facade of the tomb? Or how many individuals were buried in this tomb? What can the grave goods tell us? What kind of visual imagery do we have? What can it tell us about the afterlife? Things like this. So it's really about putting it all back together and, of course, focusing on the wider context.
Playing the puzzle master of getting all of those small pieces back together and all the subdisciplines that come together in an excavation like yours. As you mentioned, there's so many different types of archaeologists or specialists that's happening there that I think sometimes people, if you just have the idea that archaeologists are out digging all the time, or that movie idea that it's not just one person doing everything, knowing all of the things, reading all of the languages. It's really split across a wide number of people participating together in one of these excavations.
Definitely. For example, on my own excavation, we had a ceramicist, someone studying the pottery. We had an architect and a surveyor, so he would do an accurate plan of the tombs themselves. We have, like I said, the bioarchaeologist to work with the human remains. So it's teamwork, really. And it's then, like at the end of the day, bringing it all together.
If we can turn to something we talked about last time, and I think what will set up kind of the conversation that we're going to go to today, the mortuary structures that we discussed some previously. And you mentioned here is one of the areas that you spend your time with. When people are thinking about a place like Petra or some of the architecture that's connected with the Nabataeans, one of the most visually striking aspects that we have from them are these large monumental structures. Could you say a little bit about the dominance of those? They feel like such an impending and imposing, all-present sign there. When we're looking at the architecture, the archaeology side, we have that. But then we also have, this is something that people are living next to and living among. What can that tell us about the relationship between the living and the dead in and around these spaces?
So Petra and also the other major Nabatean city of Hegra in northwestern Saudi Arabia, they are both their landscape, is dominated by these rock-cut facade tombs of varying sizes, which are very prominent in the landscape. So they're carved on, in the case of Petra, they're carved in the valleys on the cliff faces leading in and out of the city. At Hegra, they're carved on the sides of the rocky outcrops that surround the residential area of the city. So you can't miss them. Wherever you are, you see tombs. They're the most visually striking and dominant aspect of the cultural landscape, like you say. So I think we have to remember that this was something that people saw and interacted with on a day-to-day basis during their daily life. You're always surrounded by these monumental funerary structures, and you're reminded perhaps of those in your family, your ancestors who have died. You're reminded of death. Obviously, mortality rates were much higher in antiquity, so death was probably occurring much more than it does, for example, in our daily lives. And we're used to perhaps, in English-speaking countries and Anglo countries, having the cemetery sort of tucked away in a city or in a town, on the edge of the town, or it's not something, unless you're perhaps, obviously visiting a family member or a deceased loved one who's passed on. It's not somewhere where we frequently go to the cemetery on our day-to-day life, is it? It's not, we don't go and hang out in the cemetery and have a picnic there. So it's a totally different concept, and we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the Nabataeans and imagine how their day-to-day life was living in these cities and dominated by these tombs. So it does suggest a much more fluid boundary between the living and the dead, I think, especially as I think we'll discuss about the funerary practices that were taking place at these tombs and how often they were visited. And also you have to remember the noise of the tomb carving, the kind of chipping away as these tombs were always, being carved and constructed. So that noise would have been ever present, I think, too, in the city. You have to remember that. Yeah. So it's kind of multi-sensory. Perhaps the burning of frankincense is part of the ritual. So it's the smell as well. So you're constantly surrounded by death in that way.
I hadn't even thought about, I think maybe one of the most obvious parts of this, making these things. You see them and they're there. They're so imposing and they're these finished things. But yeah, if they're happening, if the construction of them is happening in the midst of your everyday life, you're walking past these places like you do any construction site today, and you're able to see how the progress is going along. Or the incense, that is so multi-sensory. That is a totally different approach to understanding how you're relating to or seeing or participating in, whether it's your grave or somebody else's grave, the dominance and the relationship between these things as they're spread throughout your everyday life.
And you have to remember, we're just seeing the end products here. You have to imagine the process. There's at least 630 monumental facade tombs in Petra alone. So that's a lot of tomb carving within a period of, say, 200, 300 years or so, when we know they were carved. So, it's an ongoing process. There's lots of unfinished tombs as well. So we have to bear this in mind as well.
I guess with that number of tombs, do we have any kind of idea of how many laborers would have been participating in the construction of one of these monumental tombs? Is this a dominant part of the economy, that we are participating in the construction of these, and that's a good employment opportunity because you're walking maybe past it in your everyday life, but you're also, this is my job. I go and I make these things. Somebody has to be making them.
Well, we're lucky in that the inscriptions carved on the facades of some of the tombs at Hegra actually have been signed by the stonemasons who made them. So we have some information on the stonemasons, which appear to be two prominent families. So it's a familial profession.
It's a family business.
And it's a family profession. So there seem to be two dominant families of stonemasons. So, such and such as father and grandfather was also a stonemason. So it carried perhaps some sort of prestige with it, obviously. The fact they're signing it, they're proud of their work. We also know from the Nabatean terminology, there were architects as well. So we have, just as we have in modern day construction site specialists working on a project. So we have, they would have been general labourers who did the hard work. We'd have the stonemasons who perhaps do the decorative details, and the scribes, of course, who are engraving the inscriptions.
And then coming in, putting the boss's name at the end to take credit for the finished project. No one has any connection to that. Nobody understands that anymore. Mm-hmm. That doesn't happen. That's just something that we get in the Nabatean.
And of course, it would have been quite a risky job. You're up high, on the rock face. I'm certain there would have been some injuries and possibly some deaths as well for those involved in carving these tombs, on small platforms as they're chipping away and moving their way down the facade. There would definitely be some injury.
There has to be, and no net laying out underneath you like Golden Gate Bridge construction to help you if you fell. That is a part of this. I think the human side of this is one of the parts with where we're going to go in this conversation of conceptions of the afterlife and the relationship that you may or may not be able to see in this. But thinking about the living part of the construction of the place where the dead will lie brings in a whole another layer of the people making it, the process of making it, and then those functions that this space serves. Because as you already hinted at a little bit here, this isn't just a place that serves a role for the dead interred there. It has a lot more variety of function available to it for the living. What are some of the things that we're able to tell about these spaces? What types of functions outside of just a resting place did these sites serve?
Well, most of the tombs, even the smaller facade tombs, have at least a frontal platform, or you could call it a courtyard or a yard in front, which is a natural product of the carving of the tomb. As they went into the cliff face, of course, they had to remove the rock, and it creates this space in front. But a lot of these spaces can be lined with benches for sitting and enough space for gathering, at least a family gathering. And then some of the larger tombs even have multiple features attached to them. And so they're really being considered or labelled tomb complexes as such. So these can have not only a frontal courtyard, sometimes provided with side colonnades. They can have additional chambers. They can have dining rooms, so triclinia or biclinia. These triclinia can be rooms with 3 benches, or the biclinia have the 2 benches. So that's for reclining and feasting, gathering. So we know that there's spaces that accommodated groups of people, most likely the family visiting their dead family members.
So designated spaces, not kind of a secondary, we have found a way to make use of this. This is an intentional part of that construction.
Yes, it's part of the plan of the tomb, the whole tomb complex. It wasn't something sort of thought of later on. And we even have the one funerary inscription we have on the facade of a tomb that's written in Nabatean, that's the Turkmania tomb, that even lists some of the components of the tomb complex. So it talks about the porticos, the courtyard, the triclinia, the garden, and also the cisterns, so a source of water. That's another thing. If you're going to be eating and gathering at the tomb site, you need water, of course, for purification rituals, perhaps, for washing the dishes, cleaning, cooking, all these things. So water is a very important part as well.
If you were to make a guess, or maybe you know the exact percentage here, if you were to think of one of these spaces that is designated, I think in our mind, this is a grave space, this is a burial space, which it did serve that. But if it's doing all of this other stuff, how much of that space is dedicated to the spot where the dead lie, and how much of it is left open for the places where the living are coming back to participate in this space?
Well, the burial chambers are surprisingly quite large, even in some of the so-called smaller tombs. There's enough space to stand up. Now, I don't know how many tombs you've been into, Jordan, in your life.
Not as many as you.
But there are those that you have to really squeeze into, and it's a very enclosed space, and it's not the kind of space you'd hang out in for a long period of time. You can't stand up, it's not comfortable, it's dark. But the Nabatean facade tombs have spacious chambers. It's quite comfortable inside. High ceilings. You have niches for lamps, so they would have been well lit as well. They have quite tall doorways, so it's not a problem going in and out. So the actual space for the deceased inside is already quite spacious, and it's possible, the living were going in and out of these chambers as well as part of the ritual. And the space outside can be just as large as well, the courtyards in front of the tomb, or the dining rooms that are attached to the tombs. So equal amounts of space, I would say, for the living and the dead.
That's such a fascinating change to the way you see, because they are so imposing from the outside, and they feel like these grand spaces, which they are, and some of the ones that are so high up that are inaccessible or seem very difficult to get to, that thinking they are intentionally designed from their very beginning to be a place for the dead individual, but also for all of this ongoing activity and function, changes the importance or the interactions, I think especially the interactions that this might open up between the living and the dead. And so I think we have to ask maybe one of the questions that's sitting, at least in my mind, do we know anything about the ideas, the Nabatean ideas of the relationship between the living and the dead, ideas of the afterlife? Is there anything we can get from things like inscriptions or the graves or grave goods that shed any light on what their thoughts are?
Well, the difficult thing in trying to understand the Nabatean concept of an afterlife, or how they view death, is that we don't have a Nabatean literature or Nabatean history that they've written about themselves or about their own mythology. We only have the brief comments of Greek and Roman geographers and historians talking about the Nabateans. And all the Nabatean inscriptions we have, there might be a few thousand of them, but they're very simple. They're usually just signatures, or asking for blessings from the gods, or asking for such and such to be remembered. So we don't have a great deal of information from the Nabataeans themselves. So we've got to try and deduce all this by studying the architecture, like you say, studying the grave goods, looking at how the dead were actually buried. We can only do this from excavations, and studying the few funerary inscriptions we do have. We can try and then deduce something and come to some conclusions by taking all these elements together. So, for example, from the few tombs that have been excavated, we know that the Nabataeans preferred a very careful burial. They put a lot of effort into burying the dead, into a careful treatment of the body, making sure that the corpses were protected, that no one was going to, disturb the burials or loot the burials. So just to give you an example, in the tombs that I've worked on in the Royal Necropolis, we have pit graves. So these are just graves carved into the floor of the chamber of the tomb itself. Some of these are 2 to 3 meters deep, first of all. And then at the bottom, you'll have, the corpse, and if they were, obviously, these have been looted, unfortunately, in the past, but we can see that the burial was placed at the bottom of the grave, usually put in wooden coffins. From Hegra, we know, from the excavations at Hegra, we know they were wrapped in shrouds. And then we have layers of mortar and stone slabs sealing the burials right up to the floor level. So can you imagine just how hard it was, to break into these graves? Even for us, the fact that they already had looters' holes, it was still took a good week or so just to remove all the mortar and the stone slabs to get down. So a great amount of time, effort, money was put into protecting the burials. So we can see that. We can see that from the archaeology. The fact they've got these massive monumental tombs and the effort gone into decorating them also shows us that it was important to give the dead an important place, an eternal home, as they sometimes called it in inscriptions, Bethlehem, eternal home, eternal dwelling. Now, if we turn to the inscriptions from the tombs at Hegra, again, we see the same thing. We see there's a concern that someone's going to violate the burials or the wrong person's going to be buried in the tomb. So they cast very much in legal terms the Hegran inscriptions, and they say who the tomb belonged to, and they say who's allowed to be buried in the tomb. So such and such as sons or his daughters or his wife, as an example. And there's curses where they invoke the gods, or they lay out fines to anyone who violates the terms of burial. So from all this we start to see a picture of, that it was important to protect the dead and to give them this kind of eternal place of rest. So that's the first thing we can kind of see. Okay, it doesn't give us much insight into whether they had the concept of an afterlife, but it gives us an idea of how they perceived death and how they took all these measures to protect their dead.
There's a real sense of precaution and care in the legal language. If you're taking the time to carve that into stone, to make these inscriptions to accompany these graves, there's a real sense of concern with that. And in these spaces, given the proximity between the spaces and some of these large spaces within the burial chambers for the dead and these spaces for the living, from what we have, it's not thought of that this is a place, if this is an eternal home, is this all a home for that dead individual? Or is this understood as, no, this section is for us, the living, to come and participate in, and the dead are resting or remaining in their part? Or is all of this kind of considered that home, and when we come to visit one of these places, we are coming into the home of our ancestor, of our dead relative, and we're entering into their domain?
I'm not sure we can really answer that at this stage with a lack of textual evidence, but we do know that the whole tomb area seems to have been considered as sacred. We see carved betels, which are the carved blocks representing the gods, carved at the entrance to the complexes or nearby the tombs. And this kind of signifies that you're coming into a protected or more sacred, sanctified area. So we know that it was definitely kind of passing from the world of the living to the world of the dead when people did visit these tombs. And there are some really obvious crossovers. For example, we have some triclinia, which, as I mentioned, are dining rooms with 3 benches around the sides, that have burials in their back walls. And it seems that these weren't normally added later, but they're part of the whole plan of the triclinium. They're very much part of the initial carving and architecture of that room. So the living were literally dining with the dead, or the dead they were off the back wall, so they were where the focus was put of the feast or the gathering or the ritual. So they're partaking in that feasting together. So that's really where you see these fluid boundaries and these.
Yeah, you're not just going to that place anymore. You're among them, quite literally.
And they're really, those examples are fascinating to me. There's not that many of them, but there are a good handful of them, and they are really interesting.
So fascinating in complicating the way that these spaces are understood, or what we can understand about how they functioned, which again is a difficulty given, as you've noted, what we do have. And with archaeology, there's always interpretation that goes into the artifacts or to the discoveries, where textual records can be really helpful in flushing some of this out. And you mentioned that a lot of what we have there is coming from some of these external sources describing some of these practices for us. Within the burial customs that we have, or some of the ideas potentially of what's happening in these spaces that we can draw out, can we see any overlap? Is it possible to identify interchange of practices or customs between some of the different cultures that are making their way into Nabatean ideas of death? Because you mentioned like the triclinia, that's something that people maybe are aware of from other contexts as well. Are there other elements like that too that come in that become a part of this Nabatean idea?
It's quite difficult to pick it all apart because, like you say, the ritual of feasting, funerary feasting, the idea of having a monumental tomb for the deceased family members, this is all common to the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern area anyway. So it's very hard to kind of work out where it came first or who's influencing who. But we do see crossovers, for example, with Greek and Roman funerary customs. We find some burials with coins. So this could relate to the original Greek custom of placing a coin in the mouth of deceased as payment to Charon across the river Styx to get to the Greek underworld. So there are some crossovers like that. And obviously also with Egypt, via Alexandria, we see that some of the tomb complexes share features with Alexandrian tomb complexes, monumental rock-cut Alexandrian tombs, which are in fact underground, carved down into the ground. So we do see crossovers, but it is hard to pick apart, given that so many of these customs are in fact more universal, across the region.
Right. Which is a helpful thing because it shows the importance of this universally, but difficult, to pick those parts apart, which everyone always wants, the which came first. But as you said, that's an impossible thing to get to a lot of times when it's showing up in so many contexts. Who is bringing what part of this puzzle piece into this larger picture can be very difficult to understand.
In that context, though, also, the funerary inscriptions can provide us with interesting insights. So John Healy, who worked on the Nabatean funerary inscriptions, he noted that there were some crossovers with Jewish funerary inscriptions from the same period. So some phraseology that's really almost identical. For example, let the tomb not be opened over somebody is a specific thing that you find in both. He also noted parallels with Greek and Lycian funerary inscriptions from the 5th century BC, the way they're kind of both cast in legal terms. So there are interesting things if you go down the avenue of studying the funerary epigraphy as well.
Which I think makes sense given their role as an essential part of this trade network that they have in their everyday life and their living life, all of these connections, this network that reaches into all these different regions. If some of those pieces are coming in and who is going where, how do the directions of influence go is difficult. But seeing those connections, it makes sense given their daily lives as the trade captains of this part of the world, that those connections come through into what we're doing in our life, comes into within what we're doing when we're dead.
I mean, we see the same, we see Greco-Roman, Egyptian, Mesopotamian influences in the funerary architecture itself. So it's no surprise then that we also will find parallels with the funerary customs or the burial practices.
If I can return back to some of the questions around ritual feasting that we have happening in these spaces of the dead, who is able to participate in this? If we have inscriptions that tell us only so-and-so, only these individuals can be buried here, do we have similar things describing who's allowed to participate in activities in these spaces, or is that a little hazier for us?
Unfortunately, we don't. So we have to presume that it was the family members coming to the gravesite and partaking in these rituals and in the feasting. That's the idea, given what we know about the inscriptions, and we know these were family tombs, and they accommodated burials from multiple generations. So you could have people coming to sort of feast in honor of their great-great-granddad, for example, as well. So it's definitely important. I mean, it doesn't exclude the idea, of course, that there were other groups coming to honor the dead. We know from inscriptions, general inscriptions around Petra, that there were possible associations who came together in honor of a specific god. So they met and had ritual feasting in honor of this or that deity. And there could be guilds as well. Like we know that there were groups of these families of stonemasons, so it is possible that it was based on profession. At the moment, it's not, it's not 100% certain, but it's looking at it could be that way.
But the opening is there for varied types of identity associations between these individuals to participate. In that, I guess, expanse, as you noted here, multi-generational burials and potentially a wide range of individuals coming in. Do we see any patterns with when these spaces close to this type of activity? Is this something that is just kind of continually going on as more people are buried here? The practices of this go on, or does it seem like there come phases where certain tombs are closed, that this space is now done for the living and it's just a mortuary space at this time?
Well, unfortunately, due to the lack of funerary inscriptions at Petra and also the fact that most of the tombs have been looted and lived in, disturbed, we don't have a lot of clear chronological evidence to be able to say when specific things are happening and when they're not happening, for example. So it's a little bit hazy there. But the recent excavations of shaft tombs, these are less monumental tombs that are carved down into the bedrock, up on the North Ridge by Professor Megan Perry. That's been really interesting because she's been able to tell through her excavations that at some point near the end of the 1st century AD, beginning of the 2nd century AD, now this is when the Romans in fact annexed Nabatea into the province of Arabia, it seems that what happened was houses began to be built over the funerary area on top of these tombs, and a new northern wall has been erected there. So there didn't seem to be a problem with building houses over these areas, but it seems in some cases, while there were no new burials in these tombs, they were still perhaps visited with time. So you could see that maybe the last burials had already gone in, but they were still sometimes provided with access to be able to go in and out and perform ritual there. So that's really interesting. Similar to the tombs under the Khazne, which you might remember we discussed last time, access was kept open for those, even though perhaps, that there were no more burials taking place. It seems that perhaps people could still come in and out and perform ritual there.
Could you say a little bit there about some of the chronology? I think for someone who maybe listened to the last conversation, we did discuss there some of the spans of time that we're talking about. But when we're looking at some of these tombs and the practices that are potentially occurring in them, what periods of time are we able to draw the most from and saying, maybe some of the tombs that you've worked on, these come from these periods, and that's where we have, even if it's limited, the most that we have here, and here are spaces where maybe we would like to learn more to try to lay that out? Is it uniform across all those different phases, or can we see progression from what we do have?
Well, so far we know that most of the facade tombs were carved in the period between, let's say, the end of the 2nd century BC up until the Roman annexation, so end of the 1st century AD. We don't have strong evidence to suggest they were continued, that they were still carved after the Roman annexation, but this could just be lack of evidence, of course, lack of excavation of these tombs. So we know that the bulk of them were in that kind of period, which is the height of the Nabataean kingdom when it was really prosperous. And with the tombs at Hegra, because of the ones that have inscriptions, we're able to securely date them because they actually include the date of the ruling king. So those inscribed tombs at Hegra were carved between AD 1 and AD 70 odd, around there. So the first 70 or so years of the 1st century AD. So they're probably, that corpus is really interesting because we can then trace changes that took place within that century. And that's what Judith Mackenzie did in her great study of the architecture of Petra, looked at the date of the tombs, and then if she could see any changes happening with the architectural decoration, for example. So a lot of what's been done with chronology is actually based on the architecture and the architectural decoration, because we just have so few that have been excavated, so we can't really jump to conclusions based on just a handful of excavated tombs.
And the scarcity of excavated tombs here, I think, comes back to a point that you discussed before when we were talking about Petra, about how much of Petra has been excavated. And you're discussing here the scarcity of tombs that have been excavated. Out of what we know exists, how many of those are still, for the scholarly community, yet to be considered or excavated? And is there any kind of idea of what we think might lie outside of the ones that we know, given that it's impossible to speculate what may be underneath the sand. But is there the sense from these kinds of spaces that there might be a lot more waiting to be found?
Well, I think in terms of the 600 or so facade tombs, I doubt that we're going to see or find any more undiscovered facade tombs, given that they're carved into the side of the mountains. There are...
They kind of have bright flashing lights around them saying, yes. Consider me.
There are those, though, that have been buried with sand with time, and we don't know for how long. So you can see the top of them, and the sand's built up and blocked the doorways. So we don't know for how long they've been closed up like that. And so some of those examples could be really interesting to clear, because they could have been like that for centuries, and then they weren't lived in by Bedouin, for example, or disturbed. So they could be really interesting examples. But that's a lot of earth moving. That's a lot of time and money just to remove that amount of sand. And some of these are in locations where it's not easy to excavate. So main tourist areas, for example, that would be, too much disturbance to visitors, or it just logistically wouldn't work. Now, I think the most information probably now, new information, will probably come from excavation of pit graves and shaft tombs, the less monumental examples, such as those that Megan Perry works on, because they are more protected, being underground, and they weren't sort of used as houses. They might have been used to dump rubbish or dead animals and things like that, but there could be some of those that, of course, we haven't discovered yet. So they could prove really interesting.
And they as well served as this type of space where the living and the dead both had practices together. That wasn't just for those monumental tombs, correct?
There are some shaft tombs where you can see perhaps dining areas associated with them. So flattened areas or platforms on the surface next to the openings that could have been used for feasting or gathering, libation holes carved in the rock. Things like this, lots of shattered pottery. So there were rituals taking place at the tomb site. It's perhaps just less obvious, maybe not as much money's been invested in it. So yes, the same activities were taking place, feasting at the tomb site, just in a less monumental fashion perhaps.
Adapting the practices for the type of site that they had available.
Or maybe a more communal area, maybe people with less money had to share the feasting space. So you might have a number of openings of shaft tombs, and then they may be sharing one platform or outdoor area. So it's kind of makes sense.
That does make sense. And that's interesting, because then it does, the question of who's participating in these types of spaces, who's allowed into these spaces. If it's a communal thing like that, I guess you're trying to make sure you can get into the space, that you have your reservation in place, or whatever is happening there, of how do we come into this? Is everyone doing this together? Are we separated by what individual we're here to participate with? Changes the lived dynamics of this, I think, again, with how we're understanding how these things functioned. Could I ask a question for you, a personal question, given some of the uncertainties, the unknowns here, as someone who spends their time excavating these, studying these? What's the question that you are trying to chase down right now out of all of the things that are on the table in trying to understand the burials or the ideas of the afterlife or the relationships or the grave goods? What's the part of this that has your fascination right now?
Well, I am very much interested in these fluid boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead. This is something that really interests me, and I love working on this. And I'm also quite interested in why Strabo, the Greek historian and geographer, tells us that the Nabataeans treated their dead like dung. I think we discussed this last time as well. So he says that they buried their kings beside dung heaps, which obviously doesn't add up to what we see, these magnificent tombs. So this kind of fascinates me, the fact that, we've got this Greek author stating something that seems wrong to us. Now, was he wrong? Was he just being biased? Was he, what influenced him? So this kind of fascinates me at the moment. And also the Nabatean concept of an afterlife, and if there was one. This is something I'm always striving to understand more. The other really interesting aspect about these tombs is this crow step motif that we see on them, the steps, either the big half crow steps or the wee miniature ones that go across the facades. We still don't know the meaning of the crow step for the Nabataeans. It was common in Mesopotamia, it was common in the Hellenistic East, not only on funerary structures, but on palaces as well. But we don't know what it meant for the Nabataeans. And it obviously meant something to them. It meant something important because it's so prominent on the tombs. So that's something that would be nice to figure out or to look into more.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot left there for you to prod and explore. And I hope for all of us, but also for you personally, one of these wonderful inscriptions could come along and shed some new light into some of these questions, because this is one of those topics that we are fascinated with now, just as everyone has been fascinated with through history, the relationship here between the living and the dead. How do these spaces go together? What types of connections can we see between communities over time? This is still one of these questions that we are all thinking about, and being able to see some of these ancient perspectives, I think, helps understand the broader desire to search and explore this type of question.
And I think what's also really interesting is the question about the idea of having a monumental tomb and all the money that goes into it and the practices. And we've got to sort of ask ourselves, is that because death was so common back then? You know, it happened a lot. They didn't have advanced medical care like we have now. You know, now people are getting older and older, and we're able to prolong life, and we have cures for diseases and medicines. So death is kind of getting maybe further and further away for us, and we kind of don't want to think about it because we want to push it away and not kind of deal with it. But I think we can learn a lot from the Nabateans or ancient people in general about how to deal with death, and maybe they were much more kind of at ease or comfortable with it because they were maybe more used to it. Is that the case? Or is it the case that, you know, they didn't have fancy phones and cars and things like we do now, or how people like to show off their social status, for example, and their wealth? So did they do all that by building a fancy tomb? Was that the reason, you know, and having these elaborate rituals and things? Was it all about showing off your wealth and your status, and kind of cementing the family identity or the tribal identity as well, while doing it?
For me, that's one of the questions with this of, who is this really for? I think connected on what you're saying right there. Is this for that dead individual? Is this for the family of the dead individual? Or is this for everyone who is living that's going to participate in this? Which is a hard answer, a hard thing to try to understand, especially with such limited materials. And it doesn't just have to be one, I guess, either. But who would you say, if you were to try to put your pin in one, where would you put yourself on who you think these things are for? Are they for the dead? Are they for the conspicuous consumption side of, look how wealthy I am? Or do you find yourself leaning to that, it's for everyone who's among the living, that, remember, this might just be around the corner?
Well, I do think it's both for the living and the dead. I mean, you see how much they wanted to protect the dead and give them potentially a happy afterlife, or make sure that they're well buried and cared for. We haven't discussed it much, but the idea of leaving grave goods with the burials. So we have coins, pottery, figurines, personal items, perhaps. Now, was that because they wanted to give them items that would serve them in the afterlife, or was it simply personal items that meant something to the deceased, and it was just a fact of, you know, wanting to bury them with something important to them? So there's that aspect, but then it's also, you know, very much for the living as well. All these funerary rituals are to help them process grief as well, you know, and to accept that someone in the community and their family has died. These rituals serve that function. And then, like you say, also showing off, redefining the family's identity after someone's died, after a loss, and showing off your wealth and your status at the same time, and cementing community values, maybe showing off a kind of shared or collective cultural identity, by partaking in these common funerary rituals and by everyone having similar tombs. That's another aspect. So it's definitely for both the living and the dead, I would say. But yes, obviously it's driven by the living, considering that some of these tombs were planned for by certain individuals before they'd even died. So they're thinking ahead about the tomb they'll build for their family, and for their descendants as well. They're thinking about looking after their descendants if they had the means.
With all of the practices that we have here and the questions of, is this for the living? Is this for the dead? Could I ask a follow-up on the memory side of this? How do these preserve the memory of the dead? Is there a concern in preserving the memory of the dead for the living, for the dead, for something else? How does this fit into that?
Well, the Nabataeans were definitely interested in commemorating the dead, commemorating the deceased. And we see this through, you know, just the idea of building a monumental tomb for somebody to commemorate their memory. And also we see this through the funerary inscriptions that we do have, commemorating who's died and stating what their profession was and who's in the family and who their descendants are or who their ancestors were. So that was a really important aspect to them. And not just the tombs, but we also have these what are called nephesh carvings. So nephesh in Nabatean Aramaic literally means self, the self or the soul or the essence of the person. And we see these nephesh carvings, which are basically obelisk-shaped or triangular-shaped carvings in the rock around Petra and also Hegra that commemorate someone who's died, but they may not be buried at that particular spot. So maybe they've died outside of Petra. We know, for example, the inscription underneath the nephesh saying someone who died outside Petra, but they're from Petra, so they wanted to be remembered there. So it's really just like a memorial or a gravestone as such, but not attached to an actual burial. So these are really interesting as well. That's showing us that the Nabataeans wanted to preserve the memory of certain individuals, especially those perhaps whose remains aren't physically there.
Well, it sounds like there are still plenty of unanswered questions here that we might be able to get you back on in the future as things come to light, if new material comes out here. But this is one of those evergreen topics, the relationship between the living and the dead that concerns who is this for, which doesn't have simple answers. But Dr. Wadeson, I thank you for coming in to share some of what we do know here, some of what we don't, and maybe what we could take away from this. I really appreciate you taking the time to come in and explain this to us today. I really enjoyed it. This is such a fascinating topic.
Thank you for having me.
For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, I'm Jordan Jones. Until next time.